Welcome to the darker side of boxing, Season 2, Episode number 8. This episode is all about Paul Sykes. Paul Sykes might be a man that, if you're listening from the USA, Canada, or somewhere in Europe, or even Australia, you might not know who this guy is. You might not have any clue who this guy is. So you might be thinking, am I really going to enjoy this episode? Well, strap yourselves in because you are. This is the darker side of boxing. There are always stories about particular characters within the sport and incidents that have occurred outside of the ring in their lives which have led to them being in some sort of folklore. And Paul Sykes is no different. He's written his name into British folklore for many different reasons. And we're going to explore all this in the episode. Johnston, this is one that's quite close to home for a lot of people. There is a lot of documentaries, there's a lot of versions of Paul Sykes' life. There's quite a few books by the author Jamie Boyle, who we will credit straight away before we get into this, because Jamie Boyle's done some great work and speaking to some people who were around Paul during his life, and I think, you know, he deserves a lot of credit for all the work he's put into it, and without people like him putting his great books together, you know, this wouldn't give us the source material to be able to put together our telling of Paul Sykes' story. So this is going to be a great episode, guys, and I hope you do enjoy it. And Johnston, I know when we talked about episode lists for season 2, you put Paul Sykes' name forward, you mentioned it, and at first I think I was in the same boat as maybe some of these US listeners. I've never actually heard of him. You know, I might sound ignorant, but I'd never heard of Paul up until that point. And when you mentioned it, and I looked into it, and I was like, oh my God, this is a story that needs to be told once more.
It is, mate. And I mean, as you say, the name Paul Sykes doesn't jump out at you straight away. It doesn't. He's not like the names we've been dropping in the dark side of boxing, some of the more famous names in boxing. But, you know, the name Paul Sykes is to Wakefield what Ronnie and Reggie Cray was to the East End, or the Richardsons were to South London, Lee Duffy to Middlesbrough, Arthur Thompson, to Glasgow, Viv Graham to Newcastle, Terry Mitchell to Leeds. I mean, there are famous guys that lived in these geographical areas within it in Britain, and they had some crazy stories, and they were famous in terms of what they did in their lives. Not, you know, what makes Paul different is that he had a boxing career, and he also had friends. He had two very famous British criminal friends in Charles Bronson and Mad Frankie Fraser. Sykesy is more remembered for the fear, the terror, the chaos, the mayhem that he caused in West Yorkshire and in those 18 different prisons that he went to. But he was also an amateur and a professional boxer that could have gone, at the very least, he could have gone on to capture that British heavyweight title. We'll go into the reasons why he never succeeded in the sport, but it was a massive part of his life, and that's why this fits nicely into the dark side of boxing.
So it all begins on May the 23rd, 1946, when he was born in Wakefield, West Yorkshire, and he was the firstborn and only son of Walter and Betty, formerly Barlow, Sykes. They lived at number 36 Dacre Avenue until 1961, when they moved into a bungalow on 29 Gloucester House. His dad, Walter, well, he had a terrible temper, and he would often take the belt to Paul if he felt that he had misbehaved. Sometimes he would just whack him for the sake of it and tell Paul, that will make you a man, lad. His mum, who was a very attractive lady in her youth, never dared to intervene. She abided by her husband's rules. If she ever got chatted up or was paid too much attention by another man, Walter would give the bloke a whack, and then Betty afterwards. Although in these days, you know, domestic violence was accepted, the Sykes household was much worse than the average, so you can just kind of get the picture in your mind of what kind of abuse Paul suffered at the hands of his father. And Paul's sister, Kay, she remembered, if anyone ever accused our Paul of anything, and it got back to my dad, he would wait until Paul was naked in the bath and take a belt to him, hitting him with the buckle end. He must have only been about 6 years old, our Paul, when this used to happen, and my mother was terrified of my dad, so there wasn't a right lot she could do about it. Outside of the House of Horrors, he excelled Paul as a natural in all sports, whether it was football, rugby, running, or whatever he put his mind to. It was his dad Walter who decided that Paul should actually begin boxing at the age of 7. He dragged him on a bus to White Rose Boxing Club in Rothwell. Paul would attend the White Rose Club, among many other boxing clubs, 3 times a week with his dad.
And when not attending, he would be training with his dad and was forced to box with his friends while his dad would actually referee. And Paul said years later, I was getting bashed in the face at 7 years of age. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Sunday mornings, boff, bashed in the face, learning how to box. How can your dad love you if he lets this happen to you 2 or 3 times a week? Now, Walter wasn't the only disciplinarian in the house. Betty would give Paul many slaps for next to nothing herself. Where you would find Walter down the bookies trying to chase a pound note, unsuccessfully, mind you, you would find Betty on her stall down the market selling whatever she could or whatever she got her hands on. Many of her gear was obviously off the back of her lorry, but that didn't matter to her. If she could get rid of it, she would sell it. And that was the main thing. And to be fair, by all accounts, she sounds like a little bit like a female version of Del Boy from Only Fools and Horses, but with a bit more of a nasty streak though than Del Boy. But by the time Paul was 13, his little sister Kay was born, and he doted on her from the moment she was born. And in the book, Paul Sykes, In Final Agony by Jamie Boyle, he wrote, little Paul idolised his baby sister a great deal. Although Kay would suffer at the hands of her father's violent abuse, Betty shielded her away from most of it. Ground rules were laid before Kay's arrival that Kay wasn't going to be brutalised in the same way Paul had been. However, by her own account, she did suffer punishment, but nowhere near the level her big brother Paul did.
Now, Kay spoke about her dad with the author Jamie Boyle. Now, he's written 3 books, as I said at the top of the show, on Paul Sykes, and many other famous villains. That's kind of his niche. And this is what Kay said to Jamie Boyle. She said, "My dad was very, very strict. He was too strict, my dad. Some might say it was down to his army background, but I just think he was a nasty git. He was very handy with his fists." Now, she gave an example of her father's temper when she was 14, and she said, "He gave me a left hook to the belly and then a right hook full force to my face and broke my nose, like he was in the boxing ring. All because I wanted a lift off my mum. I wanted her to take me to the stables." Now, Paul spent 4 years going to the boxing gym with his dad, even though he couldn't compete until he was 11. By the 1957-1958 season, Paul finally began his amateur boxing career, but his results were mixed, losing just as many as he won. Those around during his amateur career have reported that you would find Paul crying in his dressing room after some defeats, while his dad would be verbally bashing him. He did compete in over 50 fights. He represented the Yorkshire counties and competed for Young England. Paul didn't begin to excel in boxing until he was 15. That was when he displayed considerable talent and ability. Jamie Boyle writes in his book about Paul again, and he says, "Paul had the ability to move around the boxing ring with ease for his size, as he was much bigger than most of the kids his age. He had every attribute an amateur boxer needed. For example, height, reach, power, ring craft, killer instinct, and supreme fitness. The kid was a natural by then."
Well, in 1962, Paul won the National Association of Boys Club, the NABC, which is a title many professional fighters won before going on to secure world titles themselves. I mean, these are guys like Ricky Hatton and Prince Nazim Hamid, to name a couple. Now, Paul was a strong heavyweight, and it has been said that he would flatten many of his opponents within the distance, which as an amateur is quite an accomplishment, and it also demonstrated his destructive power. Now, during his time as an amateur, he boxed alongside many who would be successful in the pros: future British featherweight champion Alan Richardson, Ernie Fields, Ernie Lofthouse, and Keith Tate. When not in the boxing ring, however, Paul was just like your normal average kid. Any other kid on the Lupsit Council estate, which is apparently one of the biggest, or if not the biggest, in Europe. And he played out. He would do what any ordinary kid would do. Paul wasn't the problem, but his dad was. Many of the residents would always basically just give him a wide berth wherever they see him, especially Paul's mates, because Walter wasn't afraid to give them a clip round the ear hole too after hitting his own son. Paul went to Santhorpe School along with his mum, Betty. He also worked as a dinner lady. He was known to be boisterous and hyperactive around the playground, And reading between the lines here, we probably think he probably had undiagnosed ADHD at this point. And he actually idolized John Wayne, and he had a love for all the cowboy films. Before Paul was a teenager, his dad could slap his son around as he pleased, like we've mentioned before, giving him digs and whacking him when he gets out of the bath. But when he reached his teenage years, he was too big and just too uncontrollable to handle. At first, Paul started smoking. He actually started shooting kids and pigeons on the estate with pellet guns. And he was just beginning to turn into that bully. And it's inevitable. You get bullied by your dad, and then you take it into the streets. And that's what was happening with Paul Sykes.
Absolutely. You know, violence breeds violence. This is exactly what's happened
Yep.
so far in his life. And that bad behaviour, well, it developed into more serious crimes within a couple of years when Paul began to drink, steal cars, and started breaking into people's houses. And when robbing garages, he would beat up the people who worked there, and he beat them up badly as well. Now, by 16, he stood over 6 feet tall, and his dad, well, he could no longer physically manhandle his boy. Instead, he tried to restore his dominance by abusing him mentally. The trouble was, Paul was far too gone for any more abuse to affect him. Walter essentially had created a psychopath who was physically tough and mentally challenged, thanks to the abuse that his father had put upon him for all them years. Now, during a session at the White Rose boxing gym, Paul flipped the physical abuse on its head, and he assaulted his father in front of witnesses and left his dad with a bloody nose. It wasn't just his dad that felt the wrath of his anger. His sister Kay said that if Paul returned home in a bad mood, he would grab his mum by her feet and drag her along the floor. It was around this time that Paul travelled to Germany to fight a grown man when representing England, but on the night before the fight, he got as pissed as a fart and was carried out of the pub by Keith Tate and some of the other fighters on his team. Paul lost the fight, but witnesses said that he did well to go the full distance against an established German heavyweight, considering the fact that he was hungover and he'd not trained once during his time in Germany. Now, Paul leaves school at the age of 16, and this is when his criminal activity went to the next level.
It did, and he continued to rob and steal and street fight until he was eventually found guilty of actually bodily harm, ABH, but the accumulation of 22 other offences in total actually got him sent to prison for the first time. Now, Paul says, in his own words, I deserve what I got. I deserved it. And this was when he was in his 30s when he said this. He was sentenced for these 22 offences and the ABH for a stretch of 5 years. It's crazy. For 5 years he got done here. And he went to Wakefield High Security Prison in 1963 at the age of 17. Now, how the authorities concluded that sending him to an over 21s prison was the best way to deal with him is a complete mystery. He got such a harsh sentence because the authorities said that he was wild and dangerous, and officers should approach him with extreme caution. The prison was classed as a Category A men's prison and held some of the most deprived criminals in Britain. And we're talking from the convicted sex offenders to murderers and armed robbers. The prison actually earned the nickname Monster Mansion. So at 17 years old, Paul Sykes has now moved from the Monster House, where he suffered abuse from his father mainly and his mum as well, to the Monster Mansion. And he admitted that it was actually, in his own words, what he said, it was easier than being at home. Now, that says a lot. Now, at such a young age, Sykes was considered one of the most dangerous boys in Britain. Today, Paul's mum would have probably had her children or had Paul taken away from her. And his dad would have been the one facing prison and criminal charges for child abuse. Let's be honest. But it was a different time, a different era. Now, on the documentary, Paul Sykes at large, his mum showed her nasty streak when she said, if I'd have been the judge, I'd have hung him. Or hung ya, she said. Lovely lady. It was during this time inside that his sentence was actually extended. So it went from 5 years, ended up being a decade because he hit one of the prison officers over the head when he was trying to escape with a fellow inmate and leaving the prison guard in a vegetative state. So a crazy turnaround for Paul very quickly.
Well, they must have hit him bloody hard, put him into a vegetative state. Seriously, like,
He was a big boy.
yeah,
Yeah.
this is it, isn't it? And obviously, we've talked about the abuse. The abuse is a pivotal factor in Paul Sykes' life. For me, straight away, it rings the alarm bells as to the product of the environment. We talk about this a lot in the dark side of boxing, and how some of these guys go on to be a certain way, and a lot of it's down to the product of that environment. That environment that they grow up in is usually the reason behind why they turn the way they do. Now, Paul Sykes was only at large from the ages of 17 to 30 for 9 months of that time, but he was able to keep himself active in the boxing ring, and he made it to the Amateur Boxing Association, as we know, the ABAs, in 1973. Author Jamie Boyle wrote in his book, it was at this time that Paul managed to spar with the great Smoking Joe Frazier, who was over in Britain getting ready to face Joe Bugner. Now, this is a short clip on Paul Sykes' Facebook page that you are able to see. So if anybody's not seen this footage before, it's there. Go and check out Paul Sykes' Facebook page. Now, the reason Sykes was approached was because he stood at 6'3", and he had a very similar style to Joe Bugner. By all accounts, Paul did well sparring with the great Joe Frazier, and he continued to box, and he actually had 4 amateur contests, making it to the semi-finals of the 1973 ABAs. During this time, he had moved to a Category B prison, Walton Prison in Liverpool, but was let out handcuffed to guards in a prison van. Then after he fought, he was taken back to the prison, so he was allowed to go out. It's like the day trips that they were doing for prisoners back then. They'd let him out for a day for certain specific reasons. This was one of the reasons. Paul then would box for the Bootle Amateur Club, Maple Leaf ABC, which was one of the most successful amateur boxing clubs in Britain. Paul's closest friend and former Liverpool gangster, Delroy, one half of the Showers brothers, arranged for Paul to join the new gym. Now, during Paul's ABA run that year, he beat a guy called Terry Connor, stopping him in 2 rounds before taking on Barry Peacock from Manchester. Paul knocked out Peacock in 38 seconds of the first round. Next for Sykes was an 18-year-old Paul Tucker from Newcastle, and it was a close fight, but Sykes defeated Tucker on points, who would eventually turn pro and then become an actor under the name of Paul Palance, and feature in shows like Emmerdale Farm, a popular soap here in the UK, and another popular show from the 1970s and 80s was Minder, and he'd star alongside the likes of Jimmy Nail, again, who's another well-known actor for his time during the 1970s and 80s.
It's crazy, isn't it? You sort of bump into these people, but he made it to the final as well of these amateur championships. But Paul fell short and lost to Birmingham's Garfield McEwen, even though the boxing news heavily tipped Sykes to win with ease. Instead, Sykes was completely outboxed, losing by unanimous decision. It didn't go his way. Now, it's hard to gauge just how good Sykes was as an amateur because of his lack of fights and because of his reputation outside of the ring and his reputation inside the ring, where some of the lads he fought, they were actually beaten before they even stepped foot in the ring. A lot of his reputation when he was boxing in his amateur days, I suppose, were a lot like a Mike Tyson or even a Sonny Liston before him. You know, they had them beaten before he's even threw a punch. What we do know is it was the end of Paul's ABA journey. So he got to his final, he loses it, and that was it. When he was finally released from prison at the age of 27, after a decade, as we mentioned earlier, Paul began working in the Blackpool markets and was also a lifeguard on the Blackpool Pleasure Beach. While working on the market, he actually met a young lady, and one thing led to another, and they ran off to Brighton together, got married, and she got pregnant. Now, he would like to have said they lived happily ever after. Paul stayed out of trouble for a few years, but no, that isn't what happened. Absolutely not. What she didn't know was that Paul was actually on the run from the police for various criminal offences. Now, we are unsure of all the crimes because it's so difficult to pinpoint all of them. There was quite a few. But there was one that must have been the root cause of the warrant for his arrest, and it was an armed robbery of a bookies in Haverton Hill, just outside of Middlesbrough. So now he's with his missus. They're in Brighton. She's pregnant. and the police are after him.
Oh, it was while Paul and his new pregnant wife were staying in Brighton that a friendly couple actually allowed them to stay at their house. That was until they discovered that their cat had been strangled to death. Now, we don't know this for sure, but not long after the incident, the police arrived and Paul was arrested. So we can only really assume that the couple probably assumed it was him, Paul, that did it and reported him to the police. Now, Charles Bronson, we mentioned him at the top of the show. He's got his own folklore status in the UK for being one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous prisoner in British history. Now, he actually confirmed Paul's hate of cats because they spent time together in prison. And he wrote a letter to Jamie Boyle when Jamie Boyle's writing the books. And this is what Bronson said. He said, Walton Prison had a big, large cat. It was massive, 3 times bigger than the average house cat. This was a big ginger Tom. In the late 1960s, early 70s, it was as infamous as any convict. Well, apart from the likes of Capone and Machine Gun Kelly. And a lot of cons used to buy treats from the canteen, tins of pilchards, biscuits. Some gave it milk, even chocolate. That big ginger Tom was spoilt. Bronson continued in his story and he said, now bear in mind that Walton is a massive jail, and I should know, cause up on the roof it's a great view, and I do love a roof. I hit that one in the summer of 85. Well, Ginger would sometimes disappear for a few days, but would always return. Then he did disappear, and was never seen again. That was until Paul Sykes walked out of his cell with a Davy Crockett hat on. The cat. He'd killed it, and skinned it, and made a hat out of it. A lot of cons and screws actually hated him for that. But to me, it was legendary. Only a true legend could do that, and that's Paul Sykes in a nutshell. Love him or hate him, he was a true fucking legend. And that's the words of Charles Bronson, who by many people's accounts is also a bit of a nutcase.
Absolute fruitcake. I mean, again, directed to his film, Bronson. Tom Hardy plays him. Funny enough, he plays the Craze as well. Oh, my goodness me. Yeah, so I think it was pretty obvious by that account that he didn't like cats. A lot of people said that Sykes did not like cats, and I'm guessing he probably strangled that cat, and that couple got the right up, grassed him up, and he got dobbed him. And basically, Paul was arrested in Brighton and sent back to prison. And it put an end to his professional boxing dream. Because before falling in love and running off to Brighton, he actually had applied for a professional boxing license in 1973. But it was rightly and correctly denied because he got himself banged up. Now, Paul would be given a 5-year prison sentence and he would serve 4 years of that. And he wouldn't be released until March 1977. When he did return to the streets in 77, he continued to get picked up for many different crimes. And we're going to use Dorothy Bell, a retired Wakefield police officer. She spoke about Paul's current state of mind and where he was at on his release in 77. She said, when I was serving as a police inspector in Wakefield during the late 1970s, I had many dealings with Mr. Sykes, who at the time was a top-rate criminal, an aggressive and vicious man capable of most sudden and appalling acts of violence towards both police and members of the public when the mood took him. However, as a female officer, I usually saw a different aspect to his character during his many visits to the charge office when I was supervising there, or when I came across him outside during my duties, because he always treated me with the utmost courtesy and respect. And it was Dorothy Bell who also remembered nicking him. And she said, I remember arresting him in Kirkgate for quite a minor offence on a crowded Saturday afternoon. I, a 5'4" female, took hold of him, a 6'3" powerfully built man, to signify that he was under my custody. And he immediately dropped to his knees shouting police brutality, to the amusement of the large crowd, earning him a round of applause for his performance.
So he obviously
so a wind up, really.
Yeah, exactly. You can imagine it, can't you? Now you can imagine him just proper having a wind up because he knows he could probably flicker and she'd fall over because he was such a big, strong guy. And I can imagine it. I can actually envision it. And when he wasn't getting pinched by the old Bill, well, Paul was trying to make his professional boxing dream become a reality. During his second stint inside, He had become the biggest health freak you could possibly meet and educated himself on the human body. He studied every inch of how it worked, what to eat, which vitamins to take, sprints to do, and how much rest the body needed. And all of this was learnt behind prison walls. The human body wasn't the only thing that Paul had taught himself. He was reading 3 books a week and was striving to expand on his mind. He told the Wakefield Express in December of 1990, "I have never wasted a day while I've been in the nick. I have life-saving awards, a City and Guilds in bricklaying, 22 O-levels, 8 A-levels, and a BA Physical Sciences, Open University 1982 degree, but I also have 42 previous convictions, and that's all that counts." Now, he was clearly a very intelligent man. The governor of Hull Prison, Philip Wheatley, said in the Paul Sykes documentary At Large, "He's intelligent, but he can be very short-tempered, and he has a reputation for being quite violent. There's no doubt about his intellectual ability. He's probably brighter than most of us who have locked him up." It was that violent streak that made him a liability, especially if he had a drink in him. Although he was a health freak, he would still get himself tanked up and he'd whack those who were stupid enough to drink with him. But when he wasn't drinking, he was determined to get back into the boxing ring. That day finally came, when he was granted a professional boxing license and he was ready to make a real go of it. Now, before Paul started as a professional, he told the press, "I was a bad lad, but that's all behind me now. If nothing else, prison kept me fit. I had sort of a gymnasium in there, and I just lived for boxing."
We'll go into his love of the gymnasium in prison in a little while. A very clever guy. And it was on February 20, 1978 that Paul Sykes stepped into the boxing ring as a professional against a guy called Keith Steve Johnson in the Norfolk Gardens Hotel in Bradford. Now, the fight lasted just 1 round after Johnson decided he had enough and he retired. He threw in the towel. Paul Sykes was interviewed after the fight and he was asked, "This is your first professional fight. What now?" Paul's witty response was, "My second professional fight. Then my third, my fourth, and then rows of shops, blocks of flats, holiday villas, and 750 birds like Joe Bugner." Paul was just 3 months shy of his 32nd birthday, and time was against him, and he needed to be fast-tracked. His second fight was massive amongst the Yorkshiremen, as both Neil Malpass and Paul Sykes were both from that neck of the woods. There was much hype around the fight beforehand, and it was for the British Boxing Board of Control Central Area Heavyweight title. So his second fight, and he's fighting for that. I mean, that doesn't happen. It just shows you that he had the ability and he was being fast-tracked because he was 32 or just shy of his 32nd birthday. Now, from the first bell, Sykes was on the attack, and he was well ahead by the midway point, only for him to just blow a gasket. Sykes was completely out on his feet and began covering up as Malpass now is unloading on him. The fight dramatically changed direction, and Sykes was never going to see the 10th and final round. Now, Jamie Boyle, again, he explained in his book what happened next, and this is what he said. He said, "Paul had decided that when he came out for the 7th, he would walk right over to Malpass, make no effort to box, and blatantly stick one on Malpass with his head right in front of the referee, Harry Warner. Warner had no other option but to disqualify Sykes and raise Malpass's arm as he regained consciousness, or when he regained consciousness. Paul not only lost, but he'd also lost his purse for the fight, which was suspended. So losing the fight, and he didn't like it, and he just headbutted Malpass bang on the head, knocking him sparko. And that was the end of that. Second pro fight, and he's nutting people. Wow.
I mean, we're laughing about it, but in reality, it's not funny because, like, you know,
It's not.
You can't do that. You know, like, I know who he was and what he was doing at the time, but it's like it was like frustration because he was being beaten. You know, but fuck it, I'm just gonna go and nut this guy. That way, I can't be stopped in the fight, but I'll just be disqualified instead, which is exactly what he does there. Now, following that disqualification, Paul was now 1-1. But there was still a high level of interest in Paul Sykes the boxer, and he continued to pull the crowds in, whether that be the gangsters he rubbed shoulders with, the screws in the various prisons he had the honour of staying, or the young ladies that wanted to be seen with him. Now, some wanted to see him do well, But some people also wanted to see him get his arse handed to him. Either way, they all bought tickets. Now his third fight came 1 month later against Tommy Keeley, once again in Bradford, and the audience was filled with stars from the showbiz world. Every gangster or ex-con in northern England came to watch Sykes, who was classed as the hardest man in the north of England at the time. Again, Sykes sold a ridiculous number of tickets, but the fight was a stinker. Keeley wasn't interested in going toe-to-toe, so he ran and tapped away all night, while Sykes chased him around the ring. Paul Sykes ended up winning by a wide unanimous points decision, and then pissed off with all his gangster mates to get pissed back in Heppy's nightclub in Wakefield. After a less than impressive win, top fight promoter Manny Goodall gave an interview in the Glasgow Herald newspaper on May the 3rd, 1978, saying, "He can go right to the top in a short space of time. He can punch and he can whack, and he is just about the fittest guy you've ever seen." So, he's 31. So was Sonny Liston when he started his rise to fame, remember?
Good point. Very good point. But yeah, the stamina, he's fit, but the stamina clearly wasn't there in that second fight because he got frustrated and ended up nutting Malpas. So something he needs to work on. And later that month, Paul proved his power when he was back in Bradford. He fought Neville Mead, who was also known as a massive puncher, but he was a bit slow, a bit flat-footed. Mead apparently hit Sykes so hard in the third that he did a full circle and then came back on himself. And that was when Paul realised just how hard heavyweight boxing was. Paul, though, he managed to get himself up. He showed great powers of recovery and find the strength within to knock the big punching Mead out in round 5. So that just shows you. So he's starting to make slight improvements. He's being fast-tracked, a big heavy hitter, gets knocked down, comes back and flattens Mead in the 5th. Then on July 18, Paul Sykes got a rematch with Neil Malpas, again for the British Boxing Board of Control Central Area Heavyweight title, which was back on the line. But this time, it was at the Theatre Club in Wakefield, so he now had the home advantage. The fight ended in a draw, but those within the boxing business that saw it said Malpas probably should have got it and should have got the nod. Irrelevant of all that, Paul was now 3-1-1 within 6 months, and he was striving. And he was looking for that British title shot. Now, on September 4, in Wakefield, Sykes demolished an American from New Jersey, Dave Wilson. It wasn't all that. It was a soft touch. He smashed him up inside 3 rounds. Now, the trouble was that nasty, spiteful side of Sykes came out of the ring, like in his second fight. When referee Harry Warner waved it off, Sykes continued to punch the defenseless, limp body of Wilson with a further 4 right hands. Wilson's unconscious body sank to the canvas and he was taken to hospital. In usual tradition, after the boxing victory, Paul spent the night partying at Heppy's nightclub. After his night out, Paul went to visit his opponent the next day and actually gave an interview on Yorkshire TV, which you can see is shown on Paul Sykes' at-large documentary. Now, he was actually close to tears in his documentary, and it did seem really genuine. And he said, "It sickened me this morning. It gutted me. I saw the kid there 3,000 miles from home. Nobody, no nothing." Then he choked up and he just basically couldn't carry on speaking. But to be honest, it looked genuine, but he's got this guy who's now in hospital. Sykes has put him in hospital, and it's his own fault because he should have been disqualified, to be fair, but he didn't get disqualified. Now this poor chap is on he's not looking good.
He just loved to fight, didn't he? That's the thing. He loved to fight, and he couldn't help himself. But that poor guy, was lying there in a hospital bed the next day. And I think maybe he just didn't realise, at the time, or did he? Some people might say he did realise what he was doing at that time. And I think you'll kind of get the gist of this theme throughout the remainder of this episode. Is you make your own assumptions and interpretations of, was he really, really trying to hurt people? Did he enjoy hurting people? Or was it just that he got in such a blind frenzy that he didn't realise what he'd done until after the fact? Was this a case of that? Well, as we go through the episode, you guys listening, make your own judgment on that. Now, at times, Paul Sykes did have a conscience, but most of the time, he was playing nasty. Did he enjoy hurting people? Well, apparently so. He enjoyed hurting people and scaring them half to death for his own humour, especially when it came to the opposite sex. Paul himself explained in his own book that because of his early incarnation, he preferred younger girls, and we mean girls that are literally too young to consent. Now, his excuse, in his words, was, I was a 17-year-old boy in the body of a 30-year-old man. Well, on his release from prison in 1977, at the age of 30, he began a relationship with two 15-year-old girls at the same time. Now, of course, today, we know that's not acceptable, and he would be considered a paedophile. But back in that era of time, in the 1970s, paedophilia wasn't at the forefront of everybody's minds. I mean, hey, Jimmy Savile was getting away with it for many, many years. People didn't look at it in that way. People didn't question things in that way. Whereas today, 100%, it would be classed as grooming, it would be classed as paedophilia. Now, in his book, Paul's book, Sweet Agony, he actually wrote about his desire for girls. And this is in his own words, and he said, when she walked past the house, there was a girl so startlingly attractive I held my breath. And he continued to say, she was our Kay's mate, little Kath from across the road. She was a schoolgirl, untouched and virginal. She had to be. She was only 15. Now, Paul was physically abusive to all three of his wives throughout his life. One said that she was threatened with murder when he dragged her out one night and warned her, I could murder you now and bury you, and I'd make sure your body will never ever be found. Paul went on to have two sons throughout his life, and Jamie Boyle, in his book, wrote about his estranged relationship with one of them, and he said Paul was never allowed to have any say in his life. It's common knowledge that this boy had appalling behavioural issues all the way through his life. Paul didn't understand how this was so, because it couldn't have been down to his influence, because he wasn't in his life. For many years, the truth was actually hidden from the boy about who his real father was. Certainly up until Paul was in a state of rapid decline, and that particular son, who we're referring to, he actually went on to grow up and commit such a gruesome murder that he ended up receiving a life sentence in June of 2008.
Well, I know we've moved away from his boxing career, but I think it's important to break it up a little bit. We will go back to Wilson, obviously, in hospital and what happens after that. But it's important to paint a picture of Sykes outside the ring as well, and clearly show. I mean, it's a weird thing to say that he's a 17-year-old in a 30-year-old body. I mean, and then love like 15-year-old girls. I mean, it is all a bit mad, and obviously we have jumped on a bit here, but we've got to carry on with this. And that son that you spoke about as well, Michael Sharp, he actually killed a 38-year-old police officer, David Ward, following a failed armed robbery at his home in Wakefield. The then 25-year-old became the second son of Paul Sykes to be jailed for murder, when he was actually given a 27-year sentence, later reduced to 25 on appeal. Jamie Boyle then went on to write what we were all thinking, and that was that although Paul hadn't brought the lad up, it didn't matter. I mean, the boy had the Sykes genes, and I'm afraid to say the apple don't fall too far from the tree. And that's the first thing you think of. That is why we had to stick that in. I mean, the sons are both in prison. It's crazy. Now, Jamie actually spoke to one retired prison police officer from Manchester, Strangeways HMP, and he told him that the lad is detested on the wing he's on and is a despicable bully. Now, Paul Leighton Sykes, the other son, who is also serving a life sentence for stabbing a guy called Michael Gallagher to death in a frenzied knife attack at his flat in Lupset, Wakefield on June 2004. Paul Sykes, later on in his life, was actually quoted on the Sykes Jr. murder, saying that he's now dead to me, that boy. All my life I've fought with my fists, and he took the coward's way out by using a knife. He never did speak to his son again and ignored all of his prison letters. So we've mentioned in 1977, so he's met these two 15-year-old girls, and that's the point he's at, where he's in the midst of his boxing career. But he had those two kids, and they're both in prison. So Wilson is still in hospital, and he's been remaining in hospital. So we're going to go back to that and back to the boxing. Now, while Wilson did remain in hospital for the next 6 weeks, where it was touch and go as to whether he'd actually make it, Paul did show his human side to him and felt remorseful for what he had done. So he actually helped organise a fundraising night for Dave Wilson in the Lupset Working Men's Club. And Paul even had the American stay at his home for a short time before taking him to the airport and helping him board the plane Paul actually says in his book that he hugged his battered opponent, knowing full well that he'd never see him again. Just shows you the Jekyll and Hyde side of Paul Sykes.
Well, he does, doesn't he? Like he's got that bit of humanity in him, but he can just flip like a light switch. I think that's kind of the
Yep.
gist of what we're getting here with Paul, isn't it? Throughout his life so far. Well, going back to the story, and once he knew that Wilson was on his road to recovery, he's then back in the ring, and he took on Lissimo Utobi at the Blackpool Circus, and he extended his win record to 5 after stopping him in 6 of a scheduled 8. By now, Paul Sykes had generated a lot of interest in his belated boxing career, and that was further cemented when he found himself in promotional photographs with a certain individual who pops up a lot on our podcast. And as soon as you hear me utter them words, you know exactly who I'm talking about, Dodgy Don King. And he was also with WBC heavyweight champion at the time, Larry Holmes. A photograph that you can actually find on Google Images. Just type it in, you'll see it, and you'll think to yourself, wow, I've never seen this photo in your life. I think I've never seen this photo in my life until I looked into this. Now, it is alleged that Paul did do a bit of debt collecting for Don King, but it's never been confirmed this. It could be just a wild accusation, but it's quite interesting because we know what Don King was like throughout his life when we did our episode on him for season 1. Now, on February the 13th, 1979, at the Theatre Club in Wakefield, Paul Sykes took a 10-round decision over Conrad Tuka. And it's that win that got him a shot at the British heavyweight title against the champion from London, John L. Gardner. As usual, Sykes, he had his gangster mates, and they were there at the weigh-in, shouting out that Gardner was going to get a hiding, and he was going to lose his title. But Gardner, well, he wasn't fazed by it, and neither did he fear his challenger. Years later, he told Jamie Boyle, when Jamie wrote his books, that he'd stood face to face with Sykes, and he said, "See all your gangster friends here now. They're not going to be able to help you tonight because it's just me and you, old man." John said that he saw the colour literally drain from Paul's face in seconds. Along with all the ex-cons watching it in the crowd that night, a certain Charles Bronson was at the asylum watching the fight on television. And he wrote a letter to Jamie Boyle, the same letter we used extracts from earlier. And this was what he wrote about this particular moment. And he said, "It was in Rampton Asylum. I heard his fight at Wembley Arena versus John L. Gardner for the British and Commonwealth heavyweight titles in the late 1970s. Not his best fight. Something went wrong there. All the loonies in the asylum were in his corner that night. They were cheering and they were singing, 'There's only one Paul Sykes.'" And you can just imagine that, can't you? You can imagine a lot of the mentally challenged individuals, including Charles Bronson, singing "There's only one Paul Sykes." Imagine the scenes.
Oh, don't. They're all rooting for him. I mean, he's got all those ex-cons and gangsters all sitting at ringside, and he's got Bronson in his asylum with all the nutcases. And again, you ain't seen that Bronson film. You can actually see the asylum wing in that. They paint a beautiful. Well, it's not so much of a beautiful picture, but I think it's probably pretty accurate. Well, in this fight, we're going to go to the fight. And Sykes, for once, he started pacing himself. But when he threw his favourite punch, and he called his favourite punch, it was the Sykesy right hand. And Gardner didn't fall. He landed on it, and Gardner didn't go nowhere. He was hurt, but Gardner was as solid as an ox, and he came forward. And it was at that moment, like in the Malpis fight, that Sykes ran out of ideas. But instead of headbutting his opponent this time, he turned to give up. And you can see this fight. It's on YouTube. He turns away, looks at his corner, and for me, gives up. He basically does a no-mas. And the fight was waved off in the 6th of a scheduled 15 by the referee. Incredible. Paul was adamant, though, that he didn't give up, writing his book, Sweet Agony, that he had meant to turn around and just to tell his corner to shut up because they were talking too much or too loud or something. And it was the ref's fault, Jim Brimmel, who waved it off, and he shouldn't have waved it off. Again, this fight is on YouTube. Go and look here, make your own minds up. But for us, Paul Sykes gives up. John L. Gardner went on to say that I went to Paul's dressing room after the fight, and I just said to him, "Well, the best man won, didn't he?" And Paul's reply was, "Well, he shouldn't have stopped it." I turned to say something to my corner. I, of course, disagreed and said, "Paul, you turned your fucking back on me." And we agreed to disagree as the man was talking total bullshit. Now, although Gardner believed he was the worthy winner, he did admit at times he hit me that hard, he curled my toes up. And early on, I had to weather the storm. So he took some punishment, as we said, and but he kept going forward, and that's what Paul Sykes give up. Well, basically, he knew he was gonna run out of steam eventually. I mean, he was an old man, and he couldn't go the same pace I set for him. And Gardner was the worthy winner. And just to mention, Gardner does go on in this very, very difficult era in the 1970s in heavyweight game to win, I think, a Commonwealth and a European title, and he was even sitting in the top 6 of the world behind some of the biggest names in boxing. So he wasn't a bad fighter, Gardner.
Well, the interesting aspect of Paul Sykes' professional career, I suppose, is what if? What if he beat Gardner that night? What if he become the new British heavyweight champion? What could have happened next? Well, Paul's promoter, Tommy Miller, said that if he had have got past Gardner, he would have gone on to fight Leon Spinks, which would have then led him on to Larry Holmes. I know it's all ifs and buts, but it just proves that he wasn't too far away. Interestingly, when he travelled to the United States and bumped into Don King and Larry Holmes, he stepped in as a sparring partner for Leon Spinks. Not only did he spar some of the world's best, but he sparred the future British champion David Pearce. And Paul said David Bomber Pearce was the toughest and most ferocious fighter that he'd faced in his boxing career, based on the sparring that took place at the Waterloo Boxing Gym. Sykes became good friends with Pearce, and the Pearce boxing brothers and Tommy Miller said Paul could have gone right to the top quite easily. He impressed everybody, but he was always in trouble, one way or another. He'd always have loads of worries on his mind. Sykes was complimentary of his ring career, and he actually said, "Boxing has been my salvation. It's the only sport which could have rescued me from my background." Paul fought once more as a professional on March 29, 1980 at the National Stadium Indoor Sports Hall in Lagos, Nigeria, against Ngonzika Equilium. In a very strange fight, Sykes was actually knocked out in the first round, and it would seem like he took a bit of a dive because it was the first glancing shot that he had received, and it has been mentioned that he told one of his corner that night, "You don't know what I know." So what is he speculating there? Is he speculating that he took a dive when then comments? I mean, going to Lagos, to Nigeria, I mean, Nigeria wasn't really known at that time for its heavyweight division, much like it was in this modern era, with the likes of Sam Peter coming through, these types of fighters. Was it a dive? Did he take a dive to get some money? I mean, I suppose we'll never know, but it's interesting.
It is, and you don't know what I know. I mean, that could be anything, could it? It could be. It might not be a fix. It might be just that he weren't feeling well or something, or something happened to him. But from what I've you can look through BoxRec, and the guy that he fought, the Nigerian fellow, he weren't the greatest of fighters. I think he had been beaten by one of the guys at Sykes. I think he might have been Gardner. I think he knocked him out in no time. But it's a heavyweight game. One glancing shot could knock you out. But with Paul's professional boxing career pretty much over, he was actually approached about having a fight with the governor, Lenny McLean, on November 20, 1979. And it was scheduled to be taking place at the Rainbow Theatre in Finsbury Park, London. Alex Steen paid Sykes half of his fee up front, and he was actually promised the rest of the money after he had fought Lenny McLean and the bout never ever materialized. In Lenny McLean's autobiography, he explained the reason for it not going ahead. He said a week before the off, Sykes went into a club in Wakefield where he lives, got well pissed and had a ruck with 4 doormen. He did them all, but one of them got lucky and put a cut above his eye, which took 8 stitches to pull together. Although this type of story has been a common theme in the folklore of Paul Sykes, the truth has since come out that Paul Sykes was out on the piss, carrying on with his normal aggressive antics, and ended up in an altercation with the Leeds hard man, Terry Mitchell, and not fighting for a doorman. Now, Terry Mitchell, again, we use Jamie's book because he sat down in a conversation with Mitchell, and this is in Mitchell's own words. He said, "I was in the Market Traders Club, and it all started because Paul had too much to drink, and he was picking on his old man, Walter, and arguing with him. I knew his old man was an ex-prison officer, but he was still an old man regardless, and I didn't like it. My mate tried to intervene and told Paul to leave his dad alone. So Paul took offence to this and started on my friend. So I backed my mate and started on Paul. I knew straight away that I was not going to trade punches with this fella, as he was a trained professional boxer. But he had on a really smart jacket. So I grabbed its lapels, dragged him close to me, and butted him a few times, and swung him around the bar just for a bit of good measure.
Now, Terry Mitchell continues with his story on what happened next, and he said there was a lot of grappling for what seemed like ages, but the real damage was done when I kept butting him, then spinning him around. We were both fit men at the time, at the peak of our lives, so even though we'd both had a good drink in us, there was none of this blowing out of our arses stuff. We both fought hard. Paul gave up fighting me after a while and said we should both sit down and have a drink together. Afterwards, I was covered in claret, but I never had a mark on me. Paul was really busted up and bleeding from the nose and had a deep nasty cut above his eye, and he was cut all over. We both sat down drinking, and I remember Paul being in such a state he sent his friend, who was a professional wrestler of some sort, back to Wakefield to get him a new shirt. Now, while sitting together drinking and now laughing off the scuffle, Terry was still cautious of what Paul might do next, and he said, I remember a fella said to me after, "Watch out, Terry, he's going to slide dig you." And as I got up to go to the toilet to get some of the blood off me, Paul got up and followed me into the toilets. So I was on red alert, really ready to finish the job now. But Paul came in and he shook my hand. He was right as rain with me, and that was that. His friend came back and handed Paul a new shirt, and off he went. I went over the road to continue my night in the Market Tavern, aka the Madhouse. And that's a great story from Terry Mitchell. A great story from his mouth to Jamie Boyle about what happened in that altercation with Paul Sykes. And it just sounded like Paul Sykes is just this type of aggressive drunk. You know, this is what I'm getting now from his story, is that he loves a good drink. He's a bit of an aggressive drunk. You get your different types of drunks, and he's an aggressive drunk that will pick a fight with anybody you can. In this instance, he was picking on his old man. Now, don't get me wrong, his obviously old man wasn't a very nice man towards him as a kid, and I can probably understand why he wanted to take out a lot of them pissed up frustrations on him. But he was still an old man at the end of the day, and obviously Mitchell was to intervene and try and stop this from happening. They end up scuffling, they end up fighting. Sounds like Terry Mitchell got the better of him overall, but they both ended up having a bit of respect for each other afterwards. Crazy story.
It is, isn't it? The fact that he grabs him close and just keeps headbutting him by all accounts as well. Where they love to use their head, these nutters. Well, dipping back into Paul's boxing career very briefly, he did make history by competing for the British title in the least fights ever, a record that he still holds today apparently, and I believe he's across the board as well. I don't think there's anyone else has fought for a British title so early in their careers. Now, he may have failed at the final hurdle, but Paul Sykes achieved personal greatness by sparring some of the greatest fighters in the history of the game. World champions like Michael and Leon Spinks, a young George Foreman, who, by all accounts, beat the living shit out of him in the ring. Thomas Hearns was another, Joe Frazier, as we mentioned, and John Conte all traded leather with Paul. Then there's other well-known British champions such as Richard Dunn and Bunny Johnson and Billy Graham. Ricky Hatton's former coach and former professional boxer himself said this of his first meeting with Paul Sykes. So this is when he was boxing at the time. And he said, the very first time I met Sykes, he came down to my gym in Manchester to spar with Phil Martin. But for some reason, Phil didn't want to spar with Paul. Maybe Phil thought he was going to fight him one day. I don't know. But I wanted to spar everyone because that was the only part of the training I liked. So I volunteered in Phil's place. When I sparred with Sykes, he'd just come out of prison again, but he was surprisingly good boxer for a big guy. He was fit, strong, and a clever and smart and traditional boxer. With me, smaller and lighter than Paul, I was a lot quicker, and it was easy for me to slip his shots. So it's just to show you guys that, you know, Billy Graham knows his stuff and clearly says, you know, Sykes was a good fighter. He was a good fighter. It was just he started late. Just the way life planned out for him. But life on the outside was just as short as his boxing career because he was sent back to prison for 5 years in 1981 for pointing a gun through a nightclub door at two bouncers. When Paul actually speaks of this moment in his documentary very briefly, he says, two doormen in a nightclub, I frightened them to death. He fails to mention that he was actually carrying a gun that night. And that was part of the reason why he went in prison.
Although the main reason for his return to prison was when he agreed to take a contract out on union official in Blackpool. Preston Crown Court told a local newspaper, printed, boxer was hit man, jailed for 5 years. Wakefield-born heavyweight boxer Paul Sykes was paid £1,000 at St Anne's, Lancashire, by a company director to act as a hitman to stifle the union activities of a shop steward, jailing Sykes for 5 years. Judge Norman Sellers told him that this country would not tolerate hitmen. At this point, Paul Sykes was not at the peak of his violence and terrorism of anyone that was unfortunate to cross his path. Jamie Boyle said that he spoke with one woman who told me that one hotel owner in Blackpool committed suicide because Sykes was harassing him so much. Now, during his 5-year stint, he was one horrible guy, one horrible bastard to the other inmates and the screws, who took their chances to knock Paul down a peg or two with some insults. Again, Jamie Boyle explains this in greater detail in his book, and he said, after speaking to several prison guards over the years, I know that many of them used to tease Sykes over this also. At times when Sykes was in the block, the screws that really hated him would stand outside his door and shout, John L. Gardner says good night, you cowardly bastard. Now, it wasn't only the screws that gave Paul a taste of his own medicine, but that came from only a few men that had the bollocks to stand up to him. Men such as Fred, the Head Mills of Newcastle, and Billingham's Alan Cowley. Fred the Head used to fight with Sykes every time they bumped into each other, and Alan headbutted Paul several times before he ever got a chance to defend himself. So it sounds like, obviously when he's in the inside, because he's got this reputation about him, it's always that cliche saying, isn't there? It's like there's always someone bigger and harder than you out there. And they said that in school. It was always a cliche in my school, like there's always someone bigger than harder than the guy who's supposed to be the biggest and hardest in the school. And I kind of feel like that's possibly what it's like in prison. I mean, not that I've ever spent any time there, but I know people who have, and there's always someone bigger than harder than themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a bit like, who's the daddy, isn't it? And the crazy thing is he had these scuffles, but I mean, we'll go into what other people thought of him inside the prison. I mean, he's at the peak of his horribleness basically right now. He's left boxing, and he was, we mentioned it. He wanted to get fit. He although he had a like to drink and he went out of the fight, he always wanted to stay quite fit. And he see the body as a temple. Now he's drinking a little bit too much. He's back inside, and now there's like a, who's going to be the main man. And there were, of course, occasions when the Lions would fight it out inside the confines of many different prison walls as they tried to establish their power as the leader of the pack, which is what was happening. But undoubtedly, Paul Sykes was almost always the daddy of the prison yards. He is mentioned in the book Legends by Charles Bronson, an A to Z guide of the men Bronson had regarded to be the toughest in Britain. Referring to him as Sykesy, Bronson describes him as a legend, born and bred. And he writes, I first met Sykes in Liverpool in early 70s, and at that time he was probably the fittest con in Britain. A hard man from Yorkshire, a fighting man in every sense. A lot of people never liked him, perhaps they even feared him, but I respected the man for what he stood for. Now, one of Paul's oldest pals is one of Sheffield's hardest man, and that's a guy called Clyde Bruton. And he described the level of respect and fear that Paul Sykes held when he arrived back in prison. And again, he told this, he sat down and had a conversation with Jamie Boyle, and this is what he said. He said, I'll tell you one story of when I was in Durham Nick the same time as Paul. On the wing, the word had got through that Sykes had arrived. I was there before Paul. I will not name them, but some of the very well-known hard cases in Durham got up when they heard Paul was in and walked back to their cell and closed the door behind them. I am talking about half a dozen of very well-known men who all seek the celebrity gangster limelight did that because I watched it with my very own eyes. And to add to Paul's notoriety and make him even more of an imposing figure than he already was, he actually set records for lifting weights while in prison. He was incredibly strong and held the British amateur weightlifting record for the deep knee bend at 500 pounds.
Well, I'm not surprised. He spent a lot of time getting fit in prison, didn't he? He loved the prison. He reminds me of how Mitch Green loved Rikers Island and how he used to use his time on Rikers Island to get himself into tip-top shape. That's what it was like for Paul Sykes in prison here in the UK. Now, going back to Clyde, and he also said that he saw Charles Bronson bullying a fellow con and double lifer Fred Lowe when Paul put Bronson back in his box by saying, "Leave Fred alone and stare at that wall. If you fucking move, I'm going to smash your fucking head in." Clyde said that Charles Bronson did precisely that, and he stared at the wall for the next 30 minutes without saying another word. Paul was really that feared in prison. And he was also ballsy, brash, and clearly confident in his surroundings that he once walked in to the prison governor's office by himself and took back the radio that had been confiscated. Neither the governor or the prison guards, did anything. They just stood there and watched him do it. Now, Paul had such authority that he made the governor give everybody on his floor their radios back, but as soon as Sykes was moved onto another prison, their radios were then removed once again. Again, it was Clyde Broughton that told Jamie Boyle a tale regarding another radio incident, and he said one night someone on the landing was blasting music all night, and when Sykes was shouting to turn it down, it fell on deaf ears. The perpetrator knew Sykes didn't know exactly who it was, so he ignored the shouts, and he only turned it up louder. The next day, Paul went in every single cell and smashed everyone's radio, and he then told the whole wing, "I'm sorry if it wasn't you, but whoever it really was, I've got you, you bastard."
Oh my God. Oh my goodness me. Brilliant. So out of all the hard men around, Clyde is adamant that Paul was the hardest of them all. And he said, you hear about all the Lee Duffys, the Viv Grahams, Roy Shaws, Lenny McLeans, but he was in a different league to them all. If all of them were in the same room with a prime Sykes, I'd put my life on it that it would have been Paul walking out without a mark on him. It's not commonly known, but Paul flattened Roy Shaw not once but twice in 1973 in Hull Nick. The fight lasted 13 seconds, and the second one wasn't much longer either. Well, Delroy Showers, who was a very close friend of Sykesy, he watched the first fight and he told Clyde what went on between the pair. And he also confirmed his story to Jamie, who got clarification from one of the screws. So the chance are this pretty much did happen. And even Shaw admitted that Paul was too big for me. He actually said that, too big in his own words. In the brief time that Paul was released in December 1984 until May 1985, he went on adventures traveling around the world. And, you know, for those that do know Paul Sykes will probably know this bit. So there is a book by Robert Brenton on Paul Sykes's adventures. And it's also mentioned in a documentary. And Paul Sykes is talking to the guy behind the camera, and he says, "I'm the only man in the history of mankind to swim across the Straits of Johar. Nobody has ever done it before. Not because of the currents or anything like that. It's sharks. Not shark infested, but it's the locals go paddling there. I know about sharks, yeah. Punch them right on the fucking ear hole and they swim off."
You know,
that's a legendary statement.
That clip. You know, I've seen that clip floating around social media for probably about 10 years, and I never really looked into who it was until we started to put this episode together. And when I realised it was Paul Sykes, it all seemed to make a lot of sense to me. I was like, who is this guy? Like 3 or 4 years ago, like I'm thinking, who the bloody hell is this guy? What is he going on about? And then the context in which people talk about it in, like they don't talk about Paul Sykes, they just talk about a guy who's just off his head. And they were the sort of words that were being used in social media comments when we started to put together this episode. And I come across that clip again. I'm like, oh my God, this is Paul Sykes. This is the nutcase, the guy who we're talking about, supposedly one of the hardest men in Britain. And this is that clip. So yeah, I was quite took aback by that, to be honest with you. Now, going back to the story, and Jamie Boyle does believe the story, and many close to him do as well. And he said, not many people realise it's only 0.6 of a mile long. And I spoke to Paul's mentor, John Spenceley, often, and he told me it was a true story. The shark story is true as well. Although there were only baby sharks snapping at him, Paul was escaping Singapore after running up a bill of £16,000. John told me that at first Paul thought he was being shot at, and he turns around and there were sharks snapping at him, so he started punching them, and they swam off. Now, he was, of course, in many fights, and had plenty of visits to the pubs, which he would eventually be barred from. And that's all the pubs in Wakefield, of course. A long-term Birmingham prisoner named Patsy Manning spoke about Paul's love of fighting, and they said, one particular evening I visited Rebecca's nightclub in London, and he had some trouble with 4 bouncers. The 4 of them rushed towards Paul, all throwing punches, and Paul started to throw punches of his own dead fast. They had to be, because he was up against 4 geezers who could have had a bit of a fight under normal circumstances. Any ordinary man would have had no chance on his own, but Paul was no ordinary man. His punches were greased lightning. I had to jump in to stop the fight to prevent Sykes from doing further damage to the bouncers. Afterwards, Sykes told me, "Okay, Pat, I enjoyed that little scuffle. It was great fun. If any of them want to start again, it's all right by me."
Fucking hell. Oh my days. Loves it, doesn't he? Absolutely loves it. Well, it was around the mid-80s that Paul allowed the drink to take over. He stopped playing rugby and boxing, losing all interest in actually keeping fit. Inevitably, he would go on to become an alcoholic, but we will go into that a bit later on. Now, interestingly, when behind bars, he says he actually was never interested in boozing. Paul used to say being in a nick was his break from boozing. As long as he had his pouches of baccy, it was all he needed. But when outside the prison walls, he would drink, and by all accounts, he never knew when to stop. When drunk, as I think you pretty much get the picture, his personality would change from a quite likable in some ways, an intelligent guy, into a right horrible bastard. And when he went to the pub for a drink, he always made his presence known. He would throw his weight around and mug people off for his own amusement. He was always known to make grown men stand up in front of a packed pub and make them recite nursery rhymes like Humpty Dumpty and Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. When Jamie questioned one of Paul's closest friends on the subject, he said that he wasn't being nasty. That was just Paul's sense of humour, and if he was stupid enough to do it, then more fool them. Again, going back to Billy Graham. Billy Graham was not one of them fools. Although Paul came across as a nice enough fella, he knew his boundaries, and this is what Billy Graham said. He said, when I got to know Paul, I couldn't believe what he was like, because he was really nice. Listening to Paul during a few times I sparred with him, I could tell you he was a really intelligent guy and well read. I was just shocked how polite and elegant he was, because I expected him to be some big rough fucking bruiser, but that's not what he was like at all. I'd have run a fucking mile if Paul would have invited me out drinking in Wakefield, because if this man had a couple of pints, then somebody's getting banjoed, and it wasn't going to be me. I think when he asked, I just politely declined, and I'll do the same as Billy Graham, those muppets that decided to stick around and sing Humpty Dumpty and Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Well, more fool them. My goodness, don't be around this guy when he's had 2 beers, let alone 10.
I think you must have been like, I think you would have shit yourself though, wouldn't you? Like, you think about it. If you
absolutely.
if you're in the pub and this 6'3" guy who's already known for having a reputation of being hard as fuck, and he comes up to you and says, "Listen, mate, I want you to stand up and sing Humpty Dumpty, otherwise I'm gonna fucking knock you out." You're gonna fucking do it. Like, it's as simple as that. You ain't gonna say no. Do you know what I mean? It's like, there's no chance in hell. But that was his sense of humour. That's not. I suppose you can take that as you will, really, because some people might see that as an absolute bully and nasty bastard. But some people that know him or know of him or was around him would probably say that was just him having a joke, and you could just take it as a joke. But I suppose if you're on the receiving end of it, you're probably not going to perceive that as a joke, and you probably shit yourself. So that was Paul, though. Now, he was eventually back in the nick after a short time on the outside, as we mentioned earlier. He was initially given 30 months on burglary charges in 1985, but his sentence, well, it was extended to 6 years for beating 2 Hull prison officers up. One suffered a broken jaw, and the other suffered several broken ribs. The most unusual thing is Paul wanted the extra time because he wanted to use the gym. There was a rule in place in the Hull dispersal unit that convicts who were doing over 5 years were allowed to get as much gym time as they wanted. Paul wasn't aware of this new rule, so when the screw John Rain informed him he couldn't have the gym because he was only a short-termer, Paul reacted with, "What the fuck are you on about? I've been a long-termer all my life." So Paul took the matter into his own hands, and he gave Mr. Rain and a colleague a good battering, which was reported by the press as one suffered a fractured nose and a cheekbone and a perforated eardrum. While back in Her Majesty's pleasure, Paul would send John L. Gardner numerous messages asking him for a rematch, and the Londoner explained, "Paul always wanted to have another fight with me. He told me that we should have another fight for £100,000 in the middle of a field, and the winner takes it all. He said to me, 'I've already got the backers, so what's your answer to that, John?' And I told him I'd already beaten him once, and I didn't need to beat him again." Violence was the only skill Paul had. He was educated enough to solicitor himself at times, and even won some court battles. A police officer actually spoke of Paul's character in the magistrate's court, and he said Paul knew the law very well, and in many of his amusing rants in court, the guy knew what he was talking about. I've seen many defendants make themselves look like fools, but that was never Paul when I saw him in the dock. Paul at times, he even had the judges and jury in hysterics because they just couldn't help it. I mean, imagine Paul Sykes, an educated man. He's quite educated, isn't he? This is the thing, he's quite educated, but he's probably doing it in a roundabout way, which is, he's getting to the point, but he's getting to the point in a way which has probably never been seen in a court before, and probably never been seen since as well.
Oh, mate, you could just imagine it. This big guy in there, he's his own solicitor, and he's able to get off of some of the offences he was charged with. Is brilliant. He probably thought, what's the point of paying these? I could do it myself. He was a bit like that, wasn't he? And he just done what he wanted to do. And now we have been through many stories about Paul Sykes, many of which are humorous, and they show his humorous side, and some have been a bit dark, but the darker of all are the allegations made against him while he was doing Bird. Now, this is where we do get into a slightly darker side. Now, some have suggested that he was a rapist and a homosexual predator that would seek out young men and rape them. Now, we must be clear that these are just allegations, and Paul has never been convicted of any sexual assaults in or outside of prison. Now, one of Jamie Boyle's friends who was in Hull prison in the year 2000, I think he was a part of the Leeds United scam thing with Jonathan Woodgate and that. I think he was a part of that. So he was in prison in 2000. He heard of stories about how Sykes' favourite game was the backy game. Now, it's alleged that Paul would challenge a young lad to climb through the inside of the chair, and if they were successful, they'd win an ounce of backy. The rumour, though, through the prison grapevine, was that Paul would then jump on his vulnerable victim and rape them. Now, when Jamie spoke to the former Cray gang member, who was Chris Lambiano, who was Paul's neighbour for the best part of 3 years, he said if Paul had been involved in these things like that, then he'd have never been allowed to walk with us, no matter how hard he was, because the full jail would have turned against him. Now, his other friend, Delroy Showers, said the prison stories were utter nonsense, and he even admitted to have been tarnished with that same brush himself, because, like Paul, he only ever sought out the girly geezers for consensual sex only. Even Tyson Fury's uncle told Jamie that Paul would fuck anything that moved inside prison. By many accounts, Paul used to admit that he would sleep with other men whilst in prison, and probably even persuaded some inmates to engage in sexual activities. But these rape allegations do seem to bear no bones. Paul, in the documentary, Paul obviously doesn't mention anything to do with this, but one thing he does say, which is quite fitting, I suppose, is that he says, I am not an armed robber, a murderer, a rapist. I'm not modus operandi. It usually involves giving someone a belt though. There's some people I've hit but didn't hit them hard enough, and there's some people that I should have hit but didn't. Now we'll continue with what other people have said about what we've just read out there. I don't know. Sometimes there's no, we know what they say. There's no smoke without fire. But I'm not saying he did do this. I think he probably coerced a few of the young inmates, to be honest with you, though.
Well, Paul's eldest son, Paul Sykes Jr., confirmed his homosexuality while in prison, and he said, "My dad never raped anyone in prison. My dad used to openly admit to anyone and to their faces that he used to have sex with men in prison. That doesn't make him a rapist." A police officer who knew Paul for most of the time he was on the beat said, "I never heard any allegations that he was any kind of sexual deviant, and neither did any of my colleagues down at the old Wood Street police station. I can't say for certain what Paul got up to in his many years behind bars. If it's true that he was a homosexual, then that's up to him and his business. What I can confirm to you all now 100% was that the man never had any kind of sex offences on his lengthy police record. The man was just a fucking total twat, and I have no reason to lie, but he was not a convicted sex offender." Clyde Broughton is adamant that Paul never raped any of the young prisoners. He said he would never have lived it down and that his reputation would have been tarnished. And he said, "Listen, I was in a few jails with Paul. Durham, Armley and Winston Green, and none of that ever went on. Fucking believe me, I used to train with Paul every day, and I'd shower the same time as him. I'm not saying he never used to have sex with men, because I know that he did, but I know for a fact he never nonced on anybody." Middlesbrough boxing promoter John Spenceley said that Paul told him that on many occasions he would have consensual sex with other inmates and stick a picture of a page-free model on the man's back. Paul would discuss things like that and not bat an eyelid. All these rumours have been pretty much squashed by all that knew Paul Sykes, but these disgusting stories were made even more believable because of the convicts and screws who would threaten the more troublesome younger prisoners with the myth of Sykesy, the predator. I suppose this could be a lot of people telling tales and a lot of Chinese whispers. It's quite evident, isn't it, from what's been sourced, that he was homosexual, that he clearly liked to have consensual sex with men during all them years in prison. But what's quite evident as well is that there are many people that were around him that were also very dangerous inmates that despised, sexual predators. They wouldn't have liked to be around anybody that was a sexual predator. And if Paul Sykes was a sexual predator, they wouldn't have liked him. The full jail would have turned on him. That reputation would have been tarnished. So to me, I can only really go off the people that knew him, and the people that knew him said that he wasn't that. And even police officers that probably hated him. I mean, the police officer called him a twat. That extract from the police officer says he's a twat. He's a total twat, but he's got no reason to lie about it. So to me, that if a police officer's saying that, and he's saying, right, this guy's a total twat, but he never did that, then even the people that really didn't like the guy are confirming that he wasn't any type of sexual predator.
I think you're right. I think it was just a rumor from within the prison walls. I mean, we'll speak about it in a sec, but I do think that's what it is. And he was openly homosexual while he was in prison for the boys that look more like girls, I suppose. But I think he was a strong, powerful guy. I think he would influence someone to have consensual sex, if you know what I mean. So it wouldn't necessarily be rape, and he's a predator, but he's openly said he likes 15-year-old girls. Why would he not like 15-year-old boys? And we already know that, back in this day, that, he was 17 himself, stuck in under 21's prison. And it's difficult. I mean, that police officer's obviously saying there was nothing on record. Look, he isn't a rapist to men in prison. There's no factual information to say that he was. So for me, he wasn't. And it sort of adds to this next story, and it's a perspective of one of the young prisoners called Paddy Maloney, a former criminal and also an author. He wrote The Altar Boy. He had spells inside in Durham prison through the 1970s, and on both sentences, Paul Sykes was an inmate at the time. And this is what he said. He said, the bloke used to give me nightmares. It was never anything he ever did, but it was all the stories that the other inmates would tell me about him. I would get told time and time again that because Sykes would rule the whole jail, the screws would open the doors for us, YPs on a night, and let him in to do bad things to keep him quiet. You tell an 18-year-old kid stuff like that, and he's going to be petrified. And in the same way, if you're in the sea and somebody yells shark. So back in Durham at the time, the whole jail was full of these stories of this big hairy back monster from Wakefield. If a YP was getting out of hand, one of the older cons or even the screws at the time would shout, behave or I'll get Sykesy to bum you tonight. I would be filled with these images of the screw opening the door at 8 p.m. and letting Sykesy in to get me. Many times as a kid, I would freeze if I could hear the screws walking past my cell, jangling keys, because I would think they were bringing Sykesy. I mean, that must be fucking terrifying. At the time, I can't even tell you. Fucking scary, that poor kid. I'm laughing, but wow, that kid must have been shitting his pants. And that's exactly what he was. But he did confirm that those nightmares never came true. Paul used to stroll up and down the landing surrounded by Durham jail's biggest guards, which made the horror stories even more scary. I was just a young, impressionable kid, so I'll be really in awe of all these stories, and they affected me a lot. I cannot say any of this ever went on with Paul Sykes because I never met any rape victims. If you want my opinion, it was just scaremongering stories, and believe me, they were scary at the time inside of Durham Nick. Holy shit, were they? I would have been absolutely, I think I've ever slept. And just on the side note, Paul was eventually released in September 8, 1989. But wow, what a story, Sean.
It is a hell of a story, isn't it? Because you've got different elements to it. You've got elements of homosexuality. You've got elements of him, potentially being accused. Well, he is being accused of being a rapist, isn't he? There by stories surrounding it. But I think for me, the compelling side of it is that many people are saying no, he isn't that. He isn't that at all. So take what you will from that. You either decide that he was that, and people just didn't want to own up to the fact they'd been raped by him, or you accept the fact that this is what it was. It was just scaremongering. It was to shit the young kids up that had just come into there. And I can imagine that happens a lot. Like, sort of initiation processes when these young kids come into the prisons at the time, and they're like, look, if you don't do this, Sykes is going to come into your room and get you. I mean, I'm not making this next comparison lightly, but when as children, people say, oh, the boogeyman's going to get you if you don't go to sleep at night. It's like this sort of bribery tactic that parents would use for kids. This is what the prison screws were using for these young offenders that had just come in. They were saying, like, if you don't go and fucking behave, Sykes is going to come in and going to get you. And I can imagine that's all it ever was. But, we weren't there. We can't 100% confirm it was or it wasn't, but this is the type of information that's out there that is interesting. It makes it an interesting conversation. He's gone from having different wives to becoming homosexual while he's in prison. And the one note that I thought was interesting is the fact that there was a rumor that he put pictures of page 3 models on the back of these men while he was having sex with them. And it's like, was it just because I can't even fathom like what would have been going through his head, to be honest with you, but hey ho, each to their own. Now here's two sides of Paul during this time, and this is in Paul's words, and he said, what got me into trouble in the past is having my physique as a child but not my emotions. I've altered the physical side to the intellectual side, the academic side, using my brain instead of my body. It's all the same machine, but I didn't realise that I had such a good brain until I took the wraps off and started using it. I've got a brilliant brain. Even with that said, in his documentary when Paul was back among civilization, he had not calmed down one bit. He also admitted himself, I'm an expert at violence. I've been at it all my life. I'm not a thief, I'm not a liar. I've been brought up on John Wayne pictures who punches the bad guy on the chin. They cheer him, but give me time. A former police officer who worked on the force during Paul's reign on the streets as a free man said he had dealt with him on several occasions, and he spoke about one incident where they picked him up. This officer was in the car behind his colleagues who had Paul in handcuffs in the car in front, and he recalled, "At one point we arrived at the Flanshaw lights and I could see the car going all over the road, but then it stopped. All of a sudden, the two bobbies jump out like they're dying and run off in different directions. I then run over to think I'm going to see Paul has broken out of the handcuffs and attack them, but he's just sat in the back, hands still behind his back, laughing his head off with his eyes closed. It turns out one of them had CS gassed him flush in the face, but it had no effect. At the same time, it had wiped the pair of them out because they'd sprayed it inside such a small space. Paul has been blasted full on in the face and he's laughing, and those two officers received a crossover from it, and they were the ones dying and running screaming blue murder. Now that's 100% a true story because I witnessed it, and that's coming from the officer. And you can just imagine this happening, can't you? Like, Paul Sykes, this guy's trying to, for whatever reason, this officer's trying to CS gas him. It doesn't have any effect on him whatsoever, and these two guys can't cope with it, so they have to run off out of the car because they can't bloody breathe. And I'm just thinking, wow, what do you say? Is he one sandwich short of a picnic?
I think so. I think there's definitely been elements of mental health issues with Paul Sykes throughout his whole life, and I do think that Broadmoor might have been a better place for him at some point in these times, or Maudsley, somewhere, some sort of mental health facility rather than a prison. But the same officer also spoke of more stories. One was when Paul had broken in through the back door of an on-off partner. She called the police and they arrived in their numbers, armoured up, ready. A massive number of them because this reputation he had, he had committed a criminal damage and he was using threats against his missus. So police show up, all armoured up, and they're ready to go in. And this is what the officer says. He says, "When me and my team turned up, we noticed all the back door was smashed in. We slowly crept upstairs. When all of us were upstairs, we saw Paul laid out on the bed, totally naked and pissed out of his tree, fast asleep. You can picture it now, can't you? But it got even worse because one of my sergeants stood there and whispered, 'Look at the size of his knob.'" I've just looked as if to say, seriously, most of us trying to be switched on because this was a very scary moment, but a few of the team couldn't help but laugh, which didn't help our situation. When I managed to hush everybody and got some order resumed, I whispered to everyone, "Let's get the fucking handcuffs on him before he wakes up." What happened next was about half a dozen of us dived on the bed and handcuffed the shit out of him. Paul was a nightmare for the police. One said that he wouldn't just punch you. He would kick you, he'd spit on you, he'd snarl, he'd growl. And the other thing you could rely on was his unpredictability, one officer said. He said he really was confusing because sometimes in a similar situation like that, he would be having a laugh and a joke with you or reciting William Shakespeare or other well-known poets. The guy was just an absolute fruitcake at this minute, but what a story.
Oh, they just make you laugh, don't they? Like, it's just some absolute comical stories about Paul in this episode that, I'm already sort of enjoying like these comical moments, and you can just imagine like being an officer turning up and he's pissed out of his tree on the bed, and another officer turns around and says, look at his knob. It's like, what's going on here? Honest to God, like you just can't make it up, can you? Like, these are the types of things you just can't make up.
The fact they're all ready to go and all their riot gear, basically, they all creep upstairs. He's just asleep in the bed, asleep, naked. Like, I bet they're like, "Oh shit, we weren't expecting that." Oh, Jesus.
Now, just like in the Nick, Paul would get into scraps, and there was one guy he always fought on the streets, and that was Colin Beaumont. One night in one of the locals, Colin had whacked Paul with something and split his head open and left him unconscious. Police said that when they arrived, Paul was still out cold, but when he woke, he was pissed and desperate to get his hands on Colin, but his gash was so bad you could see his skull. Police took him to the hospital to have it stitched up, but the operation was done when he was awake. They had to hold him down while he got patched up. One of the most bizarre incidents happened in 1993. A police officer described this incident and said, "A lady from the Lupset estate rang 999 emergency services and said, 'Paul Sykes has just walked into my house. Can you come and get him out?' She was asked if she'd invited him in, to which she replied no, he just walked in uninvited. When he arrived at the property, this woman was stood outside her home. When I asked her if she was the lady that rang us, she acknowledged he was. I asked her what Paul was doing, and she said, he's just sat down, and he's eating my husband's tea. Base. Basically, her husband had just come home from work and had his tea put out on the table, and Paul had seen it through the window, so he just walked in, sat down, and started eating it. The full family sat there and daren't move or say a word. Eventually, the woman slipped out to call us, and the husband just sat and watched as Paul ate his tea and didn't dare say a word, which was, of course, the right thing to do. And that's the persona that Paul had in the early 1990s. I mean, just imagine coming home from work. Imagine coming home and you're just about to get your tea. You know, a mixed grill or a steak and chips just go on the table, and your missus puts it down. Paul Sykes just opens the front door and he walks in, sits down, and starts eating your steak and chips. I think what you'd want to do there, you'd want to start putting what you'd want to do is you'd want to start putting a bit of a napkin down for him on his knee, and so there you go, Paul, and put I think you'd push his chair in for him, wouldn't you?
Oh, mate, you would, wouldn't you? Jesus, it's like, what was it? Ricky Hatton said, was it if you see Mike Tyson in bed with your missus, you'd tuck him in, wouldn't you? Oh, Jesus, that is brilliant. That is just the maddest story. Just he sat, the whole family sitting there, and they just watch you eat it. Oh, wow. Oh, sorry, that really tickled me. So around 1997, Paul was actually sent to prison for 9 months after he walked into someone's house again. But this time he turned the radio off. But unlike the dinner incident, the owner just happened to be a probation officer. Now, apparently he was walking past and he see the lady hoovering and had the radio on full blast. He just walked into the woman's house and turned off the radio, saying, you can turn that fucking thing off for a start. Oh, my goodness. Well, his sister Kay said that's the sort of scary thing he would do. He wouldn't think anything of it. I'm surprised he didn't piss on it because because that would be the sort of thing he would do. He was always walking around pissing on stuff. He did it loads. He did it on loads of stuff of mine. He'd walk into a shop. He'd piss on the bread. He always needed to go because he was always drinking. God, I could just see him just walking about, pissing on things, eating people's dinners. So he got arrested for breaking this woman's radio. And while back in Her Majesty's pleasure, Paul was now just a shell of his former self. And while inside for his last stint, this would be his last stint in prison, well, longest stint, I suppose, he never struck that same fear that he once did. But his reputation was enough to protect him. An old reputation that Peter Fury, again, said that people wouldn't even look at Sykes sideways because he was a monster. It was such a fall from grace. So when Paul got back out of prison, he was actually accused of attacking a pub customer with a billiard cue. And then he had a violent argument with a club doorman. But on each case, he was found not guilty. But look, at this minute, he's doing some crazy things, some hilarious things. But the drinks can just taken over his life. He's a complete shell of himself. And he's lost that fear factor.
Well, his drinking continued, which led to him being barred from every pub in the Wakefield area. His excuse for his insistent drinking was, if I had 5 pints of beer every day, I'm not drunk. It doesn't affect me one way or the other, but it just keeps me ticking over lovely. Apart from it helping me sleep, keeping my vitals working, and all this carry on, I ruptured a kidney in 1968 playing football, and I'd had to have about 12 pints of fluid every day just to keep it in a state of hydration. So that's his justification for it. Now, amongst all the drinking and violent exchanges, Paul managed to raise money from a charity event and open the Lupset Boys Club on his 44th birthday. Besides the club, he also started his own business called the Last Resort Debt Collecting Agency, and he was able to utilise Wakefield businessman Dennis Flint, who sent him to collect debts in Spain, and it was rumoured that he had funded his autobiography, Sweet Agony. Now, with the drink taking over, as you said, Johnston, Paul Sykes, well, he's become this former shadow of himself, and he's starting to deteriorate. He'd become a different sort of notorious character in the city of Wakefield, with the council securing a 2-year ASBO, an antisocial behaviour order, on him, and it stopped him from going into the city centre after a string of aggressive drunken incidents. Now, the Wakefield Express, they reported, former heavyweight boxer Paul Sykes has been banned from the centre of Wakefield for 2 years for abusing passers-by and using the city centre as his own personal toilet. Homeless Sykes, 57, who was this week made the subject of the city's first antisocial behaviour order, breached its hours later when he was found drinking outside flats. Wakefield Council prosecutor Bernadette Feather told the civil hearing of 25 allegations of antisocial behaviour between February 10th and July the 3rd this year, Sykes, who frequently urinated in the bus station's Bob the Builder children's ride, told magistrates, "I don't remember, but I plead guilty." And it's sad, isn't it? Like, it's a sad state of affairs. Because, let's be honest, we always see one of these types of guys in city centres, don't we? Let's be honest. Like, every city centre has one. Every city centre has one. And you just look at them and you just think he's a homeless guy. People call him hobos. That, you know, these are slang words that get used here in the UK. They call him a hobo or a bum or a homeless guy. You know, a lot of them are derogatory terms, of course. But, you know, this is what Paul Sykes has turned into. He's gone from a guy who sparred with world champions in Joe Fraser and George Foreman and the Spinks brothers, and this is a massive, massive fall from grace. Like I said, he's like the local guy you would see pissing up the bus station. That's what he's turned into at this point of his life. It's so sad. It's so sad how he's fell from grace. You know, the hardest man in Britain, and he's now pissing in the Bob the Builder's children's ride.
Yeah, I mean, it's consumed him. And I mean, he was institutionalized when you think he's always in the prison as many years as he was. And he, you know, I think he's come out and he's lost that now. There's no routine, if you like. And I think that's affected him. And I mean, this article from the Wakefield Express continued to say the catalogue of incidents included Sykes grabbing a young mother and her child in the street and swearing at them both. He's just a pisshead shouting at people. And in the statement read out in court, he frightened the woman. The frightened woman said, he was just laughing, but I felt extremely sick and I started to cry. Paul Sykes also shouted at and threatened to kill another child because she was crying on the street. Spy camera evidence of Sykes' urinating in the city centre streets was shown in court, along with footage of him rolling around drunk near the cathedral steps. Just a pisshead by this point. Instead of being this powerful, dangerous man who scared the living daylights out of all in his path, he's aged quickly, drank heavily, he smoked weed regularly, and even dabbed in other drugs like crack cocaine, apparently, as well. I read it was narcotics as well as drink. Now, he was no longer feared, and he had become a laughing stock and would be frequently beat up, egged, spat at, and do anything for a quid for his next special brew by the youngsters and the others who wanted to extract their revenge on things that he had done to them in the past, or even relatives. They say Karma's a bitch. Well, she well and truly bitch slapped Paul Sykes on numerous occasions when he was down on his luck. Again, the Wakefield Express then printed another article on August 27, 2004, saying the former heavyweight boxer Paul Sykes is off the streets and away from the constant threat of violence from teen gangs after a good Samaritan came forward and offered him a home after yet another brutal attack, which left him with a broken arm. After years of terrorizing the city, the self-confessed Hellraiser told the Express he was ready to throw in the towel. He was being regularly beaten and robbed by youngsters who actually set him on fire on 2 separate occasions, by the way. There's photos of him with all burnt face. They were just terrorizing him, as well as beating him with an iron bar. Now, if you're feeling sorry for Paul Sykes at this moment, then don't. Because he didn't bloody feel sorry for himself once. He told a police officer, and this is what he told the police officer himself in his own words, and the police officer told, as recounted this, he said, "Now then, you little cunt, yes, I've taken a beating and I've given beatings out, but you just get on with it, don't you, lad?" he would usually always tell that same officer, always look on the bright side of life, you nasty little cunt. That was something he used to always say, apparently. And then he'd give him a little wink and all for good measure. Pissed at him, he's not. He never complained. He never grasped up on anybody. He just accepted it and moved on in search of his next beer.
To be honest with you, like, you say don't feel sorry for him because he didn't feel sorry for himself, but I actually do at this point.
You can't
I can't help but feel sorry for him. I mean,
no one deserves that.
No, absolutely not. I mean, people do get hard on the luck, and you do, like I said earlier, you do see a lot of these types of people, and you just automatically assume that, the drug users, they're alcoholics, whatever it is, you do stereotype them, and I think most people do. I think, it takes a certain person to be able to look past that. And poor Paul at this point is that down on his luck that people are trying to set him on fire. Well, they did set him on fire. They're hitting him with iron bars. They wouldn't have gone anywhere near this guy 10, 15 years before because he would have absolutely annihilated these kids. These kids would have been scared of him. The kids in the prison were scared of him. Do you know what I mean? The young offenders that were coming in there. This guy had a massive, massive fall from grace. And it is really sad. And I know that people will say, well, he brought it upon himself. He brought all this upon himself. He wasn't a nice guy. He was a bit of a nasty guy, whatever. Whatever you might think of a human being, everybody's got the right and the wrongs about them. But I don't think anybody deserves to be put that low. I really don't. I suppose it's however you perceive him. You look at everything that's gone on in his life, and do you look at him in a different way? I suppose people might go back to that earlier conversation about him being a paedophile, essentially being involved with two 15-year-old girls at the age of 30. People will always have that in their mind and make their judgment on this guy straight away. Everybody's got their own opinion on it. And I'm not saying, this is our opinion, but this is an overall collective of the story. Now, going back to where we are at the moment, and the Express, they continued their story and they said Maureen Burnley of Peacock took him in after he turned out onto the streets with a broken arm. She bathed him, cut his hair, and gave him new clothes. She said someone came forward and they had a house he could live in. He is old and poorly now, and he will not really move off the sofa. I have put the gas and electric on for him and paid the first week's rent. It's a bit strange for him, after living rough for 6 years, but the main thing he is he is safe. Mr. Sykes, who has diabetes and osteoarthritis, says he would have been dead within a year if something was not done. Now, the former world champion boxer, Johnny Nelson, once said, them kids who used to bully Paul Sykes at the end of his life never had any idea the fear that man could once instill into the hardest of men. Charles Bronson said, only a dirty nonce deserves such a cold, heartless, cruel ending, or a filthy grass. There's no dignity in a drunk's ending, so it saddened me a lot. In the last year of his life, he was homeless and would spend every day getting drunk or high. People would call him a has-been, but he would respond with, I'd rather be this has-been than a never was-been. Paul Sykes died on March the 7th, 2007 at Pindersfield Hospital in Wakefield. His cause of death was noted as pneumonia and liver cirrhosis. His death certificate states his occupation as author, and the funeral service was held at Wakefield Baptist Church, where he regularly attended to see his parents, Walter and Betty Sykes, while getting drunk. Now, he is buried in the Alverthorpe Cemetery in Wakefield, and on his headstone it reads, sadly missed by all that knew him. Paul's sister Kay, who still bore the emotional scars from her brother, said, all my life I have said, and still stand by it, there never has been anybody in my life that has made me laugh as much or scare me as much. He was horrid and the nicest, funniest person I have ever met, all rolled into one.
It's such a tragic ending, really, for someone that sort of that hardest man, that label he had, to then just fall into that horrible trap of drink and drugs. And he died 61, and he looked like he was about 80 when you see the pictures. You look at that watch Sykes at large, and then go and have a look at the images of Paul Sykes when he's literally last year of his life. You couldn't tell the difference. It's like two completely different people. A police officer told, again, Jamie Boyle, after the news of his death broke, saying this is the police saying, this a policeman, it was the end of an era for Wakefield. Every police officer I spoke to was like, God, Paul Sykes is dead. I know that away from the station and on the Lupsit estate, a lot of people breathed a sigh of relief when the news broke out that Sykes had now gone. I saw the weakening gradually in front of my eyes with Paul for years, but I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't sad when Paul died. I had colleagues who didn't share my sympathetic views on him, but I just couldn't help it. No matter how many times I'd rolled around on the floor with him or received cuts and bruises. One officer said he'd now be in hell boozing in the bad fire bar with Adolf Hitler, Genghis Khan, and the Roman Emperor Caligula. Another officer didn't even believe that Sykes could be dead, and he thought that he was an immortal like vampire. A Wakefield taxi driver, Chris Campbell, spoke of how proud Paul Sykes would have been to hear the books being written about him and podcasts being done on him. I'm sure he said, I spoke with three main figures in Wakefield from Sykes' era, but they wouldn't add to Jamie's book. One of them was Colin Beaumont, and the others had a lot to do with Paul. Sadly, Colin was the biggest fish that Jamie Boyle never caught for the Agony books. He had some right stories and once even almost battered Sykes to death with a bar stool in 1997. I think that you can see the gash in his head in the autobiography as well, the scar that remains from that. The three big characters in Wakefield were going to give chapters for the books, but then they decided they didn't want to speak ill of the dead. All three, however, told me more or less, word for word, the same. They said, if that bastard Sykes, wherever he is now, where he be up there or down there, thought that people were writing books and making films on him, he would be laughing his fucking bollocks off.
Now, a retired Wakefield police officer summed up Paul's demeanour accurately when he said, Paul Sykes to many was a tyrant and a bully, albeit there was also an intriguing side to him when he was sober. Forever always one of life's unpredictable characters, yet that's what made him very predictable. That last bit may sound extremely Oscar Wilde, but it was also very Paul. And we're going to finish this story, not with a quote from Paul Sykes himself, but a poem, just like in Jamie Boyle's final Agony book, as a nod to his hard work. And a big thank you, really, I suppose, to Jamie for having that information out there for us to be able to form an episode around that and all the other information that was out there on Paul Sykes. And this poem was actually written by a Paul Sykes enthusiast / researcher named Gareth Ragg. And it's called I Am Me. And I'm going to read this poem out to everybody. And this is, I think it sums Paul up in a lot of ways very well. And it goes, I am me. I am Paul. Don't care about no one. I'll fuck them all. I've got my mentality. My mentality's bad. From being a nipper, it's all I've had. From 7 years old, I've stood in that ring. Bashed in the face, it didn't half sting. I became a Wakefield legend. Just look in the news. I got 10 years for whacking coppers and 10 years for whacking screws. Ask the people of Wakefield about my folklore, 'cause I'm the only man in history of mankind to swim the straits of Johor. If you look at my book, you'll see the cathedral steeple. That's me, running from the police, 'cause I've belted a few people. Liverpool, Leeds, Middlesbrough, Blackpool, some of the places I went to rule. I wasn't a murderer, a thief or a con. There was plenty of liberties, I took none. See these pumps around my neck? They kept me afloat while I swam a long trek. Towards the end, my days were numbered, and into a coma I had slumbered. Years of alcohol and substance abuse had left my once feared temple not up to much use. On the streets of Wakefield would be where it all came to an end. No wife, no children, not even a friend. I wish it had been different, and I wish I was alive to see you all. But I was me. I was Paul. And what do you say? It's good. It's actually a good little poem, Gareth. It's a great poem. If you actually listen to this episode and you've listened now, you'll be like, guys, thanks for reading my poem out. Well, it was a great poem. It's a great poem. That poem literally just tells you Paul's life story in a matter of so many lines. And whilst we've took 2 hours to tell his story based on all the information that is out there on
We could have
Paul,
just done that at home.
we could have just done that poem, and it would have lasted. It would have lasted 5 minutes. But yeah, it's a great way to end it. It's a great way to end it on them words. Obviously, we've got a little bit more information just to wrap the episode up. But before we do so, like, there's a lot that people could take away from it, really. People could take away different elements of Paul and say, well, no, he was just a guy who was this, this, and this. Or they could say he was a guy that wasn't so nice. And I suppose that's what we always do with the episodes, don't we? We'll line it up for everybody to really have their own interpretation of what Paul Sykes was like. We didn't know Paul personally. We never got the opportunity to meet Paul. We didn't start podcasting until, 4 or 5 years ago. Paul has been dead since 2007. So this story lives on through the likes of Jamie Boyle and his books, and the likes of documentaries on YouTube, and obviously podcasts like this. This is how his legacy does live on through that. Now, final words then for this episode. So while spending 21 out of the 26 years in prison up to 1990, Paul Sykes, as we've mentioned many times in the episode, actually released his book, Sweet Agony, which won the Arthur Koestler Literacy Award, an award for artistic achievement whilst in prison. And you can get this book as an audio version for nothing if you do sign up. It's not something we've had the opportunity to fully get a hold of and listen to, but there are elements out there that you can listen to on a bit of a freebie, and it's probably worth doing it. Like, you might listen to this podcast and think we've not got everything in there, and there's elements that maybe we could have added into it, but there's so many different stories on Paul that we could have easily added into this episode, but it would have took away a lot from what everyone else has already put out there. Guys like Jamie Boyle, who's done a great book and multiple books, that would have took a lot away from what he's already put out there and the work he's put into it. And there's a lot of other things in the pipeline for Paul Sykes' story, which I don't think is quite finished yet. Now, in terms of his boxing career, we've never really mentioned what his record was. So just to sum that up, his boxing career was 10 fights, 6 wins, 4 by knockout, 2 losses, and a draw. So in 10 fights, he was maybe one step away from getting ranked in the heavyweight rankings of the world and potentially going on to fight Leon Spinks. In 10 fights, that's just how it wasn't really deep in the heavyweight division back then. Back at that period when he was fighting, it just goes to show you how there was a lack of depth back then. And I think it just goes to show you how close he was to getting onto that big stage. He was close. And it's these demons, it's this mentality, that switch that I mentioned earlier, the light switch, that he ruined it himself. I felt like he ruined it. There was 2 major fights in that career, the Gardner fight and the Malpass fight. The Malpass fight, he headbutts him, gets disqualified, and then the Gardner fight, he just turns his back and he says he doesn't turn his back on him, but these are sort of open to interpretation. You can look at that YouTube video and determine whether you think he turned his back on him or not. But he could have been on the big stage, and it's quite evident he had the talent to at least challenge during that period of time. Not suggesting that he would have gone on to do anything more, but there was definitely the talent there to potentially challenge. And it's sad that a lot of his demons took a hold of him, and a lot of the incidents outside of the ring had led to so many different stints in prison, and he just couldn't seem to help it. I just get the interpretation that he just loved violence. Whether it was violence for the right reasons or whether it was violence for the wrong reasons, he just seemed to love violence. He said it himself, I'm an expert in violence. That sort of sums him up quite nicely. I think that is an apt title for the episode, is, Paul Sykes, an expert in violence, because that is exactly what this episode has been all about in some way, shape or form. But Johnston, now we've had the opportunity to cover this episode, we've put a lot of information into it from various different sources, and we've put together this story where there are still elements of this story left to be told, because there is in fact a documentary to be made about him. And I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on this story as a whole, and what sort of a film would it make? Because I'd actually love to see a fully produced documentary on him, because I do feel like that would be a really interesting watch, as long as they put in all the necessary information.
I think that it'd be an amazing watch, and I actually think what would be quite fascinating is the end of his life and how that panned out, because that, like we see it on the streets. It's sort of when we started really getting into the depth of that last bit where he's just a pisshead on the streets, pissing and everything, walking to people's houses, eating their dinners, and then getting bashed up, set on fire by these young youths who wouldn't have even been able to tie his laces, let alone even lay a finger on him back then. He would have absolutely wiped the floor of all of them. For the best part of 6 years that was going on as well. Really must have been so sad. It was some of these, the guys, Terry Mitchell, I think it was, that tried to go and visit him, and he said he couldn't believe it. He was just sitting on the bench having a drink with this just pisshead. It's just a sad way of ending it, but it's dark. It does get dark, really, and there are some elements in it. I mean, he wasn't, for me. I mean, he was in prison for a long time. I mean, 18 different prisons. What was it? 20 odd? Was it 21 years in 26 years up until like 1990? He was completely institutionalized. He needed prison. And I think there was even times when he was drunk, he would go into a police station and say, can you just take me in for the night? Give me some food, lock me in one of the cells, because he needed it. Otherwise, just living homeless. I think there was a huge mental health issue, and I think someone missed something. I mean, it's pretty clear he was abused as a child. We don't really know the ins and outs of that abuse either, because the abuse is sort of just brushed aside. In the documentary Sykes at Large, the dad's questioned about it, and he sort of says, yeah, I was heavy-handed with him, but we move on. And that's not as simple as that, mate. You have created a monster. You damaged this kid, and he's gone on to become this person. And the mum didn't help, even when she was on. If you watch the documentary, if you haven't seen it, watch it. It's only like 50 minutes long, but the mum and the dad come across. I know they're old now in it, and you sort of you give acceptance because they're old. That was not a nice place to be around, and Paul was severely damaged as a young boy, and then going into prison, into that high security prison. And he was a big lad getting in fights, and that just consumed him. That consumed him. He turned into that character, and that was what we gave him, and the authorities gave him. If there'd have been some intervention and he had some help, take him away from that house, and someone give him, I don't know, do something. What could that? It was child abuse, so it would have been remove him, like a child looked after, and moved him out of the area. There's so many things they do today, and it was the area that he lived in that let him down, and from there it was too late. It was too late. By the time he was in that prison for the first decade of his life, that was it. And then he wanted to box so much. He had talent. He almost got there, and then he gets done. In the ABAs, he could have gone on the next year and probably could have done something. He's in prison. Then he's in the pros, and he's too late. It's too late. You've spent a decade in prison. No matter how strong you think you are. If you're not in a boxing ring training, he's lost that 10 years. If he'd had that 10 years, he could have potentially gone on to actually do something in the boxing industry. But I think seriously, Sean, for me, it's a mental health issue. But what can you do? I mean, the stories are hilarious. I mean, I've literally cried with laughter with a couple of them stories again. And it's dark side of boxing. I just find myself laughing all the time because it's just crazy stories. But if they do make a film, who would play him? I don't know. I really don't know. I'd be interested to know who would actually play this big 6'3" guy from Yorkshire. I'm struggling to think who could play him. Couldn't be Tom Hardy again, could it? Look, I hope they do something. I would do a film or they do a documentary. But the one thing I will say is the comparison reminds me of Mickey Ward's brother. When Mickey Ward's brother falls into crack, Dickie Eklund. It reminds me of that story. But I know obviously he goes to prison, but he ain't like this big tough guy like Paul Sykes was. He just fell into the crack situation, but it's that same sort of thing. And then they just went down this path. It just grabbed the hold of them, and they couldn't get themselves out of it. And it was never going to happen for Paul Sykes, was it? When we had Pinkland Thomas last time, and he managed to get himself out of the deep hole he was in. Just unfortunately, Paul Sykes just kept digging and digging and digging, and that's the sad part of it all. And he didn't care. What was he calling that cop? You little cunt, whatever. I don't care. This is the cards that life dealt me. And he just carried on with it. I don't know. Oh, mate, it's an interesting story. And if Ronnie and Reggie Cray, I know they were boxers, and if they had a couple of pro fights, we'd do a dark side of boxing on them. I don't mind these little ones. It's nice to have the big fighters, don't get me wrong, but the ones where people like, it's a bit left wing, isn't it? Frowning, he was a pro for 10 years, but boxing was a huge part of his life. And it's what a story. I mean, it really is. And it's so, again, please go and read the Agony series, and you can get your own opinion on Paul. But I think we've painted a pretty decent picture of him.
I think so. Yeah, I think we have put a good story together. I've enjoyed putting the story together. I hope people do actually go out there now and look at Jamie's books and maybe go as far as obviously buying these books and reading them yourself to get more of an insight, because obviously we've put some extracts in here from Jamie's books, but for some of the hard work he's put into it. But also there's been obviously newspaper articles, different comments from different people around at the time, and it all forms a bit of a picture of what he was like as an individual. And you can only, you can have different emotions about him. You can either hate the guy, you can either laugh at some of the incidents that he's done, which, has actually made us cry with laughter, going into the house and eating the tea. Don't get me wrong, it's funny, but it's sad because that at the time there's a serious issue causing him to do these types of things. But for us, it's like, you can't help but have that comedy moment about it, because you can just visualize this happening. But at the end of his life, it just seems so sad for him. Like, so sad that it had to come to an end the way it did, and the demise the way it did. And don't get me wrong, I don't condone some of the bad things that he's done in his life, but surely there's obviously got to be a bit of respect put to his name for some of the good things that he did in life, and some of the reasons why he held respect were sometimes for the right reasons, not just the wrong reasons. So whilst you'll have your own opinion of it, I honestly think, like, it's a story of two different things for me. It's sort of a guy who was very feared, once feared, and that massive fall from grace that ends to ultimate sadness for me. Like, I think the story itself is one of mixed emotions for very many reasons, and which is why I've enjoyed covering it. I've enjoyed covering it because there's many different elements of this guy's life that I think need to be retold in different ways. So you've got books, you've got documentaries, and hopefully you will have a full-on feature-length film on it, where it'll be able to put this guy into a bit more of a perspective, and maybe the people that didn't want to speak to Jamie Boyle on his books, maybe they would come out for that. Maybe they would give us more stories. Maybe there'd be more interesting things that would come out of the back of it. I do feel like there are still things that we don't know, and still stories that we don't know, which actually might be either comical, sad, or just downright violent. And I think there are definitely stories out there still to be told about him. So who knows, maybe the future will bring us some more stories on Paul, and it'll be really interesting to see what does come of it over the next couple of years. But for everybody listening, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode 8 of season 2 of The Darker Side of Boxing. And if you have, please do go and let us know on Twitter at darker_side_pod. If you've not already followed us on other social platforms, you can find us at the BTR Boxing Podcast Network on Facebook, Instagram, and on YouTube as well. And a big shout out to all our patrons who will have access to this episode early for their membership and their support of this podcast network. For those that are listening and maybe have not checked out the Patreon page, please do go and check it at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast. On there you will find membership tiers to get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, Patreon-only recorded content, visual and audio. So please do go and check that out. And if you can support the podcast network and you can help us continue to grow and continue to provide you with brilliant series such as this and Legendary Nights and Career Profiles, then please go and check it out. And please, if you can, support the podcast network. It's been a pleasure, as always, to deliver another episode of this season, season 2, episode number 8. All about Paul Sykes, a man that was the cult of violence, a man that was the cult of personality. We've really enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.